We would now like to open the long table discussion, which leads into an open Q&A. And I put a couple of times, please post your questions in the chat and they can be taken up, and you can join the conversation then. So for the long table, you see the speakers, most of which are part of the Einstein Circle Fashioning Education, and we're really thrilled to have two fashion design students also with us joining the conversation today. There's Timisola Shazania joining us from London. She's a menswear fashion design student at Centre St. Martin's, and there's also Melchior Rasch. Make yourself known a little bit, who is a fashion design student at the Berlin University of the Arts. And then joining the long table also is Oliver Ebert, director of the Leibniz Institute for Research on Society and Space in Berlin, and Dilys Williams joining us from London, who's the founder and director of Centre for Sustainable Fashion at London College of Fashion. And Tanvir Ahmed, who's also joining us from London today, who's senior lecturer in fashion and race at Central St. Martin's. Thank you all for joining us, and I pass over to Oliver for a quick sort of a few provocative words in a way to get this long table started.
Good evening all together, and of course you're raising quite a few expectations because I'm now everybody is expecting something provocative, and I'm not sure how much I can come up with expectations. So I'm a trained economic geographer and also a sociologist, and I'm commenting on this debate a little bit from the sideline. So I'm not in fashion education, but I did some sociological research on creativity processes and also process of value creation. And thank you very much to the three presenters. The projects are really fascinating and really inspiring. And two of them were even quite geographical. So I really enjoyed these, your idea of connecting the suit, the item, and the factory building. For instance, this is something very geographical, and also the ideas about the rural communities and the lack of access they have is also a question that matters very strongly in my own discipline. So thank you very much for this. We had a similar session to this one a couple of months ago. We also heard about three alternative fashion education projects, and my feeling was a bit. First of all, I was really fascinated, and I was really positively impressed by the projects and by the ideas and by the initiative of the initiators. But then I also had a little bit mixed feelings, and I sat down and put down on paper what these feelings were about. And the title of this little essay was Beating Fashion with Its Own Weapon. So my feeling was that these projects, in a sense, were critical with the predominant practices of the fashion industry nowadays. And at the same time, these projects were themselves very fashionable. So I asked myself, how far is it possible to beat fashion with its own weapons? And this might also be the case with the three projects we heard about today. And just to give you a few ideas about, let's say, sociological knowledge about the fashion industry. So the fashion industry is described as a status market, right? So status markets are markets, for instance, that rest on uncertain evaluation criteria. So it is very much about look and feel, aesthetics, the right vibe, the freshness of color. So very subjective measures to assess value in comparison to standard markets, where the performance can be measured quite straightforwardly by applying standardized and objective measures. And this is not possible on status markets, and it's definitely not possible in fashion. And so people depend on evaluation by external authorities, and they have no or little control about the evaluation criteria that are applied. These markets are positional, so they're the performance is not valued in themselves, but in comparison to the performance of others. And it's necessary to stand out of the crowd. So you have an overcrowded market, and only very few people are able to climb up the highest position and become visible. And this also translates in winner-takes-all markets, where you have a few star fashion designers that make a whole lot of money, but also a large army of precarious workers. Then, of course, these markets are relational, so it's not only up to yourself and your own creativity, but you also need associations to others, strong counterparts, partners. Unless you don't have them, it becomes very difficult. And status markets are attentional, so it's very much about catching attention by others, by third parties, and attention is a scarce resource and also a transient resource, so it's very difficult to perform in the long run on attentional markets. And then you have, of course, institutionalized power, so brands are institutions that are charged with value, and unless you cannot constitute a brand, it becomes very difficult to make a value claims. And my feeling was that all the projects we heard about, in a sense, criticized the fashion system at one point, but endorsed the same system at different other points. And this was my uneasiness, my uneasy feeling. But thinking a little bit further, I asked myself, who else, rather than I would say reputable fashion designers, could challenge the system? So I think the challenge has to come from within the system. It cannot be carried into the system from outside. What we heard today in the presentations, I think, is something I would call institutional creativity, right? So it's not so much the fashion item itself that is creative here, but rather the institutional environment in which the fashion is created has been changed at decisive positions. And I think this is maybe the questions that we should ask to those questions. So one thing is, what exactly is criticized about of the fashion system, and what is attacked, so to say, and what is endorsed, and the second question is a group of how questions. So how is it achieved? How do you, for instance, how do you challenge fashion at this point? And what established parts of sessions can be also carried with them?
Thank you, Oliver, for this first thoughts, and I think it was a very interesting reaction of Oliver to our first public event last year, and we thought it was worth it to take it up into conversation. And I would welcome now Dilys Williams, because we had in our internal circle meetings, we already started a conversation on this topic. And yeah, I would hand over to you. Welcome, Dilys.
Thank you very much, Francesca. And firstly, a huge thank you to yourself, Renata, for organising today and for the amazing speakers, because actually it means that we can start this conversation from a different place than we usually start conversations about fashion education. And yes, thank you, Oliver, for this great provocation. And there's so much in it that resonates with me. I think we all wrestle with our own roles, with what we are supporting and what we're kind of endorsing, and you know, to take Albert Camus' idea of rebellion, what do you actually need to amplify, and what actually do you need to negate? And we have to sit within that tension of that. You know, that is what rebellion is. A rebellion is simultaneously really amplifying great work, the things that we really feel can create change, and at the same time actively negating the stuff that we can no longer sit by and let continue to happen. And I think that's something that in fashion education we have to be really mindful of. And as you say, sometimes you're having both things actually within one project or within one idea. But in my direct response, and I want to keep it short as well, because I know there's lots of speakers, is that fashion education, certainly in the Western world, is very focused on the fashion sector and feeding and serving the fashion industry. And I think the fundamental question that we maybe need to ask in response to your provocation is, you know, what does fashion education serve? So what do any of these projects serve? And that can help us to really identify the elements of it that we do want to amplify and the elements of it that actually are holding up the status quo. You know, the idea of transformation and the three horizons theory around transformation talks about the notion of the status quo and then creating new ideas, and those new ideas, as they grow and develop, either go off to be a transformed way of living and being, or they get commodified and they become a way to hold up the status quo. And we see that in and beyond fashion. So just to maybe sort of finish off this question around what does fashion education serve, I think that what we've seen today is that it should serve a range of livelihoods for a range of people around the world doing all sorts of different things, and it needs to be something that helps the skills of all of those different kinds of roles. It needs to be an incredible, curious journey around imagination of lots of different disciplines. Fashion is a discipline, but it's also lots of different disciplines, and thinking about how those disciplines can imagine a different world and imagine a different way to serve people within a more than human world. I think that fashion is, as again, these three examples of actually what it serves in society and how it serves societies and cultures. And I could talk actually quite a bit about this idea of cultural sustainability that wasn't even recognized in documentation until quite recently. There's nothing in the SDGs, for example, around cultural sustainability. So what can fashion education actually serve in terms of cultures in societies? And then the fourth element is the sector. Yeah, and as the last presentation showed very clearly, you know, the 3 R's: respect, I can't say the middle ones. I have a bit of a lisp. And remuneration. And yes, we've got to be imagine and be pragmatists as well. So I haven't probably sort of finished that off very well, but I'm very aware of time and there's lots of great speakers. So I hope this begins to have the first response to your provocation, Oliver. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dilys. And I want to pass over to Timisola and Melchior, who are, you know, with their choice to study fashion design, really sort of have voted with your feet and your hands, as it were, to see, you know, fashion as a transformative tool. And I'd love to hear your perspectives. Maybe Timisola, we start with you.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's talked today. It's really been interesting to hear different people's perspective on fashion and their idea of fashion education and where it can go. I think for me as a fashion student, within my work, I always go through my culture and try and see how I can bring that, especially studying in Central St. Martin's, which is like a university based in London, in like Western fashion, and what I'm learning within class, and ways that I can kind of bring my culture and what I learn within my work to show people that there's so much that you can say within fashion. And I think I remember like hearing that fashion is such a huge tool, because in the Western society, within fashion, is mostly with what's embedded within the industry, whereas fashion is so much more than that. And I think within my practice, and I feel like going forward, it would be really interesting to see how we can show different cultures and other people's perspective of life and what they've seen, and how they can bring that to fashion. Because again, fashion is so much more than just the clothes. It's the story, it's the photography, the films, anything that you really want to say. So I think that's from like what I've heard as well, even thinking back to what Nasiba said about sometimes it's just taking a step back and letting other people educate you and almost like tell you their own perspective. So it's more of what you can gain as well. Yeah.
Tanvir, I'd like to also bring you into the conversation. Tanvir, you're also part of the Einstein Circle, and we've had a little bit of this conversation as a starter, and you made really important points. We thought about community-based fashion learning and gave some great examples. So just over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, just wanted to say thanks again to you and Francesca for organising this. I think it's brilliant to have this space to really talk about what fashion education should be, and just echo what everyone else has said. So I think it's great to have these spaces. Renata, did you want me to I was just going to mention a collective, the Muslim Sisterhood. Shall I talk about that now?
Yeah, Francisca's going to just show the example.
A couple of images, fab. Yeah. So when I was chatting to Fashion Education Circle, and things I've been thinking of in terms of identity and culture and what fashion could be. One of the collectives that I'm quite interested in at the moment are a UK London-based group called the Muslim Sisterhood. They've been kind of working for a couple of years now, since late 2017. You may have seen them. They've already been featured in Vogue, for example, and they talk very much about how they wanted to assert their Muslim identity, and they forged themselves as a collective. And why they really appealed to me is my background is Muslim, growing up in London, and how I was brought up around fashion was in a very binary way. So I was very much the kind of Muslim identity part of me was, I'd say, invisibilized from outside of the home. So literally I would come back home from school and I would change into different sets of clothes that were, for want of a better word, modest, and it kind of kept that bit very separate. And what I'm really excited about the Muslim Sisterhood is they seem to really disrupt that binary that my generation possibly was brought up in. And I think it's interesting as we're getting more kind of third, fourth generation communities, diaspora communities, how they're rethinking a lot of these binaries that are embedded within fashion, that are part of the modernity project. And so they, to me, really seem to represent a new vocabulary around fashion that redefines what fashion is. And I think this kind of lies at the heart of the project to decolonize fashion, to really rethink what are the words, what are the tools. And I was really interested what you were saying, Oliver, about how do we criticize fashion if we are endorsing it, with in the very same kind of ways that we're criticizing. But I think the groups like the Muslim Sisterhood, they are presenting an alternative space. But I wanted to pick these couple of pictures because I think what's interesting is, as they have become more established, when they're in kind of publications like Vogue, like Marie Claire. I think it'd be interesting for us as a collective, for us to think about, you know, what happens next. So we know this about the way that fashion kind of appropriates, steals, takes things up, and how do groups like this, in this really sped up capitalist cycle of fashion, how can they maintain and sustain themselves? You know, I think this is the sort of questions we should be thinking about, because I think there are many, many more platforms and groups like this who are really exploring culture and identity in exciting ways and rethinking, you know, these definitions of fashion. But where do they go, and what happens when you know, the kind of the dominant model of fashion comes into direct conversation with them? So those are the sorts of things I thought were, you know, kind of interesting about a group such as this and how they're thinking about diaspora fashion. So it'd be interesting to hear what others think.
Thank you very much, Tanvia. I think connected to this point was also your point to really talk about the economy in different ways, or in more frank ways. And there's a comment in the chat by Hilda Heim, who said, you know, it's about various fashion systems, and by Jenna Sigal, who said it's important to recognize that fashion exists within this larger system. So, you know, how's it possible, you know, whilst existing in this larger system, to generate change?
We had discussed it previously in the meeting, that it sounded very familiar, but I guess I'm going to read this time because this is sort of the document that I kind of brought. I don't know if you can see it. It's got that blurred stuff. But anyway, I was just thinking about how familiar it sounded to Audre Lorde's critique of white feminism. So the idea that master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So it's also just understanding what we were talking about when we were discussing tools. So the idea of ideology, the idea of belief systems. And, you know, in my thinking, it was about, as the Einstein circle, where do we see ourselves in the circle? Do we see ourselves as the centerpiece, or do we see ourselves as the margins? Because that's a very important sort of understanding in terms of, you know, how we decide to dismantle fashion. Are we dismantling fashion from this idea that we're looking for this sameness that initially kind of, you know, resulted in where fashion is today, which is with a largely Western focused idea of, you know, how fashion started, how it got to this point, how it's, you know, found its position within the world? Or, you know, are we looking at accepting our differences? And, you know, and accepting our differences is accepting that the fact that, you know, our struggle where social justice within fashion is concerned within South Africa is not the same as for instance, the struggles within the Northwest. It's not the same as well in terms of Black societies within, you know, the global South and the global North. You know, that, you know, our politics are different from the African continent compared to, you know, the politics of diaspora. And so I was just thinking about, yeah, this idea of us as a circle. Are we necessarily finding we're not necessarily finding what's the same, but rather accepting that we are different. And that comes knowledge systems, but also, you know, our influences, so our backgrounds. You know, if I'm pretty lucky that I got to do theater and performance, and that kind of gave me a different viewpoint in terms of how fashion could be critiqued or looked at. The fact that you can look at one range for like 3 or 4 years is something that is not necessarily a practice within fashion, but I think, you know, once we start to look at collections like artworks, it allows us to kind of have more critique. And, you know, once you sit with the knowledge of an artwork, different arguments come up, and you know, contexts are also kind of changed based on where these collections are allowed to be shown, the conversations that they're allowed to be part of. And so in the context of our activism to transform fashion education, we need to, I was thinking, accept the social activist aims, goals, and experiences in the West are not, as I've mentioned, not the same. And then can we incorporate difference, experience, politics, and yeah, this is what I was trying to get at is, you know, what is occupying the edge? Yes, as a collective group, but not necessarily have collective sort of goals in mind. Is it a possibility? What does a ring look like as opposed to not, and I guess it kind of talks to this idea of decentralized, decentralizing the fashion system, but I'm really interested in that area. Like, what does that look like? Is it finding commonalities or is it not finding commonalities? But it's also, I think what she also mentioned in her essay is that it's not necessarily for Black people or Black designers to speak, you know, the story or educate individuals from the West about fashion from Africa. You know, it would be really interesting if people from the West did as much or took as much initiative in finding out about fashions from the African continent, the struggles from the African continent as well.
Hi, evening everybody. So lovely to be here. Such interesting conversations. I definitely agree with Lisiba. It's oftentimes the work and who has to do the work, and nobody really is willing to do work, but work has to be done. And so I think it's really interesting how we move forward within the interdisciplinary realities and relationship with fashion, with art, finding almost like a fine line or through line, really, the balance of it all. I think within the art multidisciplinary understanding, there needs to be a space of intersectionality. And oftentimes that can sometimes look more of a traffic jam than flowing traffic. And I think it's going to be really interesting how in the near future we turn oftentimes what intersectionality can look like a traffic jam into more flowing traffic. How do we keep multiple ideas, perspectives, just like many cars, whether it be your Honda, your Mercedes, your BMs, and those also come with different types of drivers. There are multiple driving forces that are pushing particular ideologies within such spaces. So how do we allow for new voices? How do we actually stop and go, actually, this is not going to work. Actually, it's not my work for me to do your work. And it's going to be really interesting to hear those voices who will be as bold as Lisiba to say, actually, it's not my problem that you have no idea what needs to happen here. It's up to you. And I think that's really going to be interesting. I think even 65 of us have checked, most of us are white women over the age of probably 30, even within this group. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see post meetings or post conversations like this, how we're really going to engage. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisiba. Thank you, Hannah, for your very interesting points. And I think that, so I'm studying fashion design in the Western world, so in the middle of the Western world in Berlin, in Germany. And I think it's very interesting that you say, Hannah, that it's it's not your fault and it's not you to deal with that. And I think that's a very important point. And Lisiba also mentioned in his talk that that it's kind of necessary to blame industries and blame the economic economic leaders of the fashion industry. And I think that's also a point we have to deal with. And me as a fashion design student, I get taught by different fashion designers, and I have projects and different companionships with different organizations and fashion labels. And I also think every time, what can I do? And don't want to be part of the economic views of fashion or the economic parts of fashion. And I think what Lesiba does with this project is a very good point, that fashion doesn't have to be always economic. Fashion can also be like activist, or fashion can also be like a political state of mind. And that was also why I asked in the chat if Lesiba is seeing his work of his project as art pieces or as products, fashion products, because I think that's an interesting thing, that fashion can also be an artwork or a political statement or something, or just a voice to say something. And I think that's very important for me as a student, that I don't have to be part of the economic things in fashion, but it's also possible to find new ways. And I think also that's a good thing of the fashion educationing circle, that you can find answers if you're a bit struggling or troubling with fashion, and also with fashion design. Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to chime in as well, because obviously, same with me, I am a fashion student, and when it comes, like I spoke about before, when it comes to my work, I usually tap into my culture, and with things like that, ways I can bring that into the Western world, because again, I'm studying at Central St. Martin's. It's based in the UK, and it's how I can bring what I've learned in my culture, I'm Nigerian, into my work. And with me, I had to go out and find all this information about myself, because I predominantly grew up in England. So it's interesting how Lesiba was talking about like being like putting yourself out there, because at the end of the day, if you want to be interested and learn new topics and new cultures and new ways to change fashion, you also have to put in the initiative. And I think that's something that hopefully will change in the fashion educational system, because like now in university, we have talks on Mondays where it's mostly about culture and cultural studies, ideally. And even though it's only a couple hours of our day, it is something that is so insightful, and that I wish that they did more of, because it's really impactful for someone like me, who has pretty much grown up in England my whole life, compared to a lot of people who want to learn different cultures and different like topics, and how like fashion isn't just, again, about the clothes and what the fashion industry has to say. It's about what you want to take from it as well. So yeah, that's my point of view.
Thank you, Sola. Tanvir.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Tim Sola, and I think the and Lesiba, I think these are really such brilliant, important points to make. So thank you. I was just going to kind of come back to methodology, because I think so many of these things that we're talking about, how do we deal with cultural difference? How do we come to terms with difference? That's such a kind of root of how we rethink, redefine, rework, reimagine fashion. And I think the methodology kind of lies at the heart of this. And part of the reason that I think collectives are so important at the moment, how they democratize and in their kind of ways of working. And back to Oliver's point about how we, who's going to challenge the fashion industry, and how do we do it? Is it an insider? Is it outsiders? How does this happen? And I think that when we start to think about, so many activist groups, grassroots groups, how they're kind of bottom up, horizontal organizing. And I think for me, many of the questions are, how do you have these kind of methods that are democratic, participatory, that are bottom up? How do you have them in an institution that's colonial, that's got violent histories, such as the art school and the university? And I think these are the real tensions that we have, because we're talking about how do we educate here, and we've got I'd argue the assessment processes are really violent. They're about categorizing people. We know, for example, in the UK, we have an attainment gap in universities between Black and brown students and their white counterparts. That's what the data shows us. So how do we think about methods that are going to address these, you know, pedagogical methods that are about, you know, about kind of bringing equality into the classroom, about addressing the inequalities that are in the classroom, and, you know, kind of having these conversations about cultural difference, about culture, about identity in these ways. So I think, yeah, the question of democratizing fashion education is key.
Thank you very much, Tanvir. What struck me in relation to what you just said and Dilys's point about, you know, what is rebellion amplifying and negating, the question arises, we can amplify, but how much can we negate? How radically can we negate? In this house, you know, can we tear down the house that we're in? Which, you know, can we cut off the hand that feeds us? So there's a question there, and I think that's also, you know, the same for the students. How radically can you question a system that you still need to validate you, to give you a future? And, you know, as let's say leading learners, we're in the same position within these institutions.
There was just one thing coming to my mind, because temporary at the moment we have like a little competition week at the moment, and we are doing a project for a store in Berlin, and we are all doing like one thing. We have a task to do. At the end, it's like a little bubble around a week where we all have this competition, and where we really can feel like how fashion industry works, or how competitive fashion sometimes is. And I think it's was a very interesting experience for me, because I really realized how students to each other reacted completely differently than in other situations than outside of the week. And I think it's very important to for the university work, that you put really hard borders around such competitive projects, because you always have to keep in mind that this is only one thing that fashion can do, and you really have to say that, okay, students, listen to me, that's just 1 week where you learn how fashion works in economic ways, but there are also a lot of different ways you can do that. And I think most of my students the students I'm studying with at the university don't know that. They think fashion is really working only in that one direction. I think we always have to mention that there are different ways to do it, and different ways to be creative somehow.
Yeah, I was gonna add on exactly with what you were saying about how sometimes it is quite difficult, because it's like, again, like as a fashion student, what do I then do when I'm put in a situation where it's like, we still have to benefit from the fashion industry in order to progress forward as creatives, but we're struggling, I guess, in a sense, with trying to like be in an educational system that is it moving forward, is it progressing? And I think for me, again, when it comes to my work, because I speak mostly about my identity and my culture, it can be quite demoralizing in a sense when I feel like my voice can't be heard, because there are certain situations where you feel like you're trying to express yourself in a way, but it almost feels like you're being pulled back, because there's a certain part of that the educational system hasn't reached, like there's a level it hasn't reached yet in order for you to fully express what you're trying to say, or like within your research. And I think, again, with like that point, it's almost like there's so much that you can do within fashion, and I really hope that that's something that we reach in this level, I guess, because I look at myself, and I also look at my friends who are also studying the same things, and what they struggle with in terms of speaking their mind, but also feeling like the industry is something that they have to like battle with. And it's quite interesting, that point you made about breaking it from within. And I think that's, yeah, like, again, it's such an interesting thing to say, because it's almost like I feel like that is what we have to do. It's almost pushing what our ideas, pushing what we're excited about, in order to say, oh, hey, I can change the industry. I can change it for the better, ideally. Yeah.